Hi, everybody joining us or watching in the replay. I'm Lisa Colon DeLay, and today my co-host is Cindy S. Lee. And we're having a conversation about the Way of the Desert Elders. And I especially wanted Cindy on here because she's a spiritual director. She's a teacher of spiritual formation and really has a handle on a lot of things that I think are similar to the Desert Elders in terms of Eastern thinking and this kind of more holistic way of seeing how reality is. And so, and I've covered Cindy's work a few different times. We've had a few different conversations. It's always been such a, like an improvement to my limited ways of thinking to be in conversation with Cindy's work. So thank you so much for coming on and joining me today.
Well, hello, Lisa. Thank you for having me here, and congratulations on your new book. I'm very excited for it. As you know, I also teach on the Desert Fathers and Mothers in my courses, so I look forward to including your book
Oh,
in my syllabi as well.
oh,
So
that
thank
will
you for
be
putting it
great.
out there.
Thanks so much. Yes, I have really fallen in love with them. And I was just speaking to someone today, especially the Desert Mothers, who are often forgotten. And they've been like my companions for the last couple of years as I've been reading their work and everything. And so it's it's a pleasure to be able to speak to people like you. I have a couple classes at my own church and just get out of my head. When you're in writing mode, everything's in your head. It's kind of insular, and it's nice to be in conversation about it. So, um, maybe for anybody who doesn't know you, now I've covered your book and your couple of your books, and we've been in conversation before. But there might be people who are tuning in and they don't know who you are. How would you like to describe yourself?
Sure. My name is Cindy Lee, and I'm a perpetual spiritual seeker and learner. That is what drives me. And so, with that,
Mhm.
then I've also become a teacher, right, of
Mm.
spirituality and spiritual
Yes.
direction. And then I've also written in that area. And
Mhm.
so, but it all is driven by my own perpetual desire and longing for connecting to the sacred and what that
Mhm.
means and the diversity of ways in which we may experience the sacred. So
Mhm.
that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, and you have your PhD in formation, is that right? Am I
In
remembering that?
spirituality,
In
yes, from
spirituality?
Claremont School of
Yeah,
Theology.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and we have some mutual friends. There's Jasmine Bellamy, and there's a few others, and it's always fun to be in conversation with. I had Jasmine on for during Lent, and so it's nice that some of the circles you have intersected with some of mine, and that's been really fun too. So I wanted to kind of kick off things with reading a quote from my book on 191, where I quote you. I don't quote too many. I think maybe two, possibly three contemporary writers in the book. I didn't there didn't seem to be a good reason for it, but in this case, I felt like it was really important to include some of your work, and so I have on page 191, which I'd like to read now, and then just kind of be in a conversation about that. And I write, spiritual director, professor, and writer Cindy S. Lee's work reminds us that the modern Western impositions of domination, hierarchy, and individualism can work to harm our collective oneness. We live quite unlike the original Christian communities who began in Southwest Asia, which is just another non-Western centered way of saying the Middle East. Unlike early Christians or Christians in other cultures, our present day Western attempts at faith community can be event based and feel quite transactional. It can be difficult to feel cared for and grounded and part of a larger body of Christ in sustaining ways. When this occurs, we tend to drift into privatized spirituality. As Lee writes, in individualistic cultures, the self is at the center, and even practices of community are determined by one's own needs. Collectivist cultures work the other way around. Their ways of knowing and practices of faith begin in a community and then move to individual expressions. Taking on the qualities of desert spirituality means um, thinking differently about community outside of individualistic frameworks, the outcomes will allow us to feel more connected. And so I wanted to engage with you, not just on that quote, but how you wind up interacting with the desert elders and teaching about them and um, seeing how their ways can interact with some of our ways of thinking. Maybe you can just expound a little bit on some of your ideas regarding that.
Yeah, yeah. I think we have an association of the desert elders with solitude, right? Being
Yeah.
alone in the desert, which then perpetuates this idea that spirituality and formation is individual and a private
Mhm.
experience.
Yes.
But what we can forget or overlook is that the first monastic communities were formed out of the desert tradition. And
Exactly.
monastic communities are intense communal experiences, right? It's
Yes.
learning and figuring out how human beings can live together in community and how complex that really gets, even down to the
Mhm.
little things. And how do you resolve conflict? How do you live in harmony together? And I
Mhm.
think that's really important for our times,
Mhm.
because our modern individualism will
Mhm.
constantly push us towards isolation and
Mm.
loneliness. And then spirituality and formation then becomes, right, geared towards individuals.
Yes.
All the while, people are longing for, desperate for community. And so we need to be asking this question about what is
Mhm.
communal formation. And I think in so many non Western traditions,
Mhm.
spiritual practices are mostly communal practices. It
Yeah.
is Western individualism that has made spiritual practices individual practices. And
Right.
so it's reconnecting with those communal practices again,
Mhm.
practices that are for the healing of community, and that community is what heals us as individuals as well.
Mm.
And so, unfortunately, I think the church has not met that need,
Mhm.
because the Western church model is often, as you quoted there, event
Mhm.
based, program based,
Uh-huh.
which allows for individuals to be spectators of faith
Mm.
and spirituality. And so then folks are needing to find community elsewhere outside of the church.
Mhm.
And so I'm actually going to turn this conversation back to you, because I think you do a good job of emphasizing the communal aspect of the desert tradition. And so, in your research and your writing, what can we learn about forming communities and being in community together from the desert elders? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Um, yeah, I think it's important for us to know in the Christian tradition, um, that stems from the Jewish one, is that these were both, early Christians and Jewish, communities were community-based. It were, in Judaism, it's a kingdom of priests. It's the entire thing is community, and the individual isn't predominant in people's thinking and people's priorities, and that's the same in the early church, and we have moved away from that quite a bit as we've been talking about, um, that when Paul writes in his letters, he's writing when he says "you," it's a plural "you," but we often will read that as a singular "you" as he's speaking to churches. He's not speaking to individuals in churches, he's speaking to the entire community, that a kind of reordering our thinking and putting it in a different gear in a way, and I think we can learn a lot by just realizing that we sort of have started off base, and if we feel like there isn't much community or depth in our relationships from church, it's because they've kind of been poorly designed in this way that diverges from how things used to be, and some other cultures aren't geared this way, that we've talked, your work mentions this, and we've talked a little bit about this in the past too, is that there are other cultures that are non-Western that kind of either by necessity or and probably both, just a different cultural mindset. It is more collectivist, and so people are thinking of the entire group before anything else. If we start realizing that some of our thinking is backward, we might be able to sort of reflect on what we're doing and understand that the desert tradition teaches us this. Like you were saying, it is this cradle of the monastic communities that then later in the medieval times for 1,000 years just were in the tens of thousands throughout Europe and, of course, all over the world. So this is the more in a sense, this is the more normal way, the more original way, and we can begin to think, hopefully, kind of re-engage with that in that way. But I don't know, like, for instance, do pastors even are pastors even getting this idea? Are they thinking, "This is about us, all of us, this community," or are they trying to reach people individually at their needs? And I'm wondering, like, when you've said, rightly, that much of church can be about programming and about events, and that goes down to individual needs. Like, what do you think are some ways that that could be completely renegotiated? Do you have any ideas about what people could do?
Well, it's going to be really hard, but it's allowing that event-based way of faith and spirituality and community, allowing that to
Mhm.
die.
Mm.
And that I think that's where people they don't know how to imagine what's
Uh-huh.
beyond that, right? And
Mm.
allowing that to, I
Mhm.
mean, it served the purpose for a time, but not anymore, and to be able to let
Yeah.
it go. But I think for
Mm.
religious leaders, often their ego is tied to tied to the performance and putting together
Yeah.
the event, and so being
Yeah.
able to let it go and to let it die in order for something new to reemerge, um,
Mhm.
is letting go of an identity that they built up for themselves, and so I think that's why it will
Mm.
be so hard, right, to let it go.
Yeah.
But whether we choose to or not, I think it will happen. Just because people are leaving the event-based,
Mm.
services and looking for community elsewhere.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
community will emerge in other forms with or without the church.
Mm, very,
And
very well
people will
said.
seek, right, the communal
Yes.
spirituality in other ways.
Yeah.
And so people in a church or religious setting, they have, right, a decision to make. Will we
Mm.
be part of that dreaming and reimagining and creating, or
Mm.
will we hold on to dear life for the way things are and used to be?
Right. Yeah, I think it was in the '80s or '90s, and again, I'm not totally sure, it might even been in the O's, because I'm not a pastor, I haven't followed it that closely, but there was this idea of the seeker-sensitive church, these books were coming out, "Be seeker-sensitive," and kind of it's a consumerist way of kind of fishing for people to come to your church, I think. But what you say about performance really, really hits home. There are pastors who kind of get excited about being the sage on the stage and, the performance of the music and the worship, and it can be very, emotional. It can draw you in this aesthetic, certain kind of aesthetic. Um, but what does that provide people in terms of their lives with each other? I'm wondering if the sermon was 10 or 15 minutes, or there was some kind of shared hierarchy instead of this, uh charismatic cult of personality at the top. If that could be dismantled and there was more happening that involved everyone together. There was movement away from performance and sermon-centered, church services that, 45-minute sermon or something like that, it has sort of done nothing, and this is my opinion, obviously, but it's sort of done nothing for the community as a whole. It's imparted wisdom or something like that. But you're right, people will wind up seeking community wherever they can find it, which might be a AA meeting, or it could be, um, you know, there's places around here where you can just go and play games. You'd go with go play games with people, and just have a life with other people and find support and find, um, relationships that can go a little deeper. And it's really a failure of the church to be performance based and leaving people with so little in the end. There's these crumbs, but to really get interdependence or dependence with each other, that takes so much more vulnerability, and it takes so much more time together and so much more intention to get there. Um, it would be a huge shift. It would be a huge shift for people to sort of divest of all the things that they've committed to with this kind of performance sage on the stage venue. I'm not a pastor, but I see that there's a lot of pressure on pastors to be kind of these special people, and that could actually be a load off for a lot of pastors. You don't have to carry this whole thing. You don't have to be the star. It could be actually about the community. And I wonder, I wonder what's in store, because God's always on the move. The Spirit's always moving, and it's not like we have to wonder. We have to hold God's hand, like, hope this works out. It's going to work out. It just might look, a little messy or a little different along the way. So,
Yeah.
uh,
And I think you have a great example in your book, actually, in the story of Jerome, who stayed with Amma Marcella for 3 years. And
yeah.
it's just an example of Amma Marcella opening up her home in
Hmm.
hospitality. And
Hmm.
then you wrote the sentence of Jerome called it domestic church, right? Just that
Yeah.
name, right? Just
Yep.
experiencing hospitality and
Hmm.
community together, working together,
Yeah.
and we can call that church, right? So then it's
Yeah.
changing and
Hmm.
shifting what
Hmm.
we label as church, and so that when
Yeah.
people are gathered together, when people are
Yes.
sharing meals and sharing
Yes.
their home together,
Yeah.
that is church, and letting that be enough.
Right. And I'm wondering too, just with um, economic times are difficult now, and I have a sense that they're going to get much, much more difficult worldwide, but in this country as well. And we might have to do things differently, like living together. We might have to have people in our homes living with us for these economic reasons, but that could be a great opportunity to become little churches in a sense, and be there for each other in ways that we haven't had to before, because we've had this luxury of abundance, which has actually distanced us from each other, many of us in certain respects. And I wonder if we should begin to think, um, should I have a roommate? Should I, but maybe not just a roommate, maybe an intentional community type of way of thinking, and where we rely on each other and we get to know each other's real issues, real hurts, and real, be able to help each other. And I'm wondering if that'll be ways that things pop up too. I wonder if just different living situations will mean that that's another way church can happen. I mean, I would imagine that would be that the case. And I think about, like, I'm working with the elderly population now. A lot of these people could use community too. There's not necessarily many people who are able to help them, but if they had younger people in their homes to live there and to share life with them, it would be a give and take. And so we'll see. I guess we'll have to see how things unfold.
Yeah, actually, I just read a book. It's a Korean book called Two Women Living Together, and it's been
Oh,
translated into English. And but it's about like two single women
yeah,
choosing to buy a home together, and
yeah,
then their experience of trying to live in community together,
yeah.
and what that looks like and how challenging that can be. But it became really popular, right, in Korea
Mhm,
and beyond Korea,
mhm,
just because of that idea of the
mhm,
rethinking, right, what it means
mhm.
to be family, what it means to be community in very practical ways, like buying a home together,
Yeah,
and what it looks like to work it out. And that's exactly what we
yeah.
get from these first monastic communities, are examples of what
Mhm.
does it mean to work this out?
Right.
Creating a rule of life so we can kind of have some, household guidance for how
Right.
we live together, how we resolve conflicts, how we
Mhm.
negotiate, how we learn from each other, all of those little things. And so we have modern day examples of that, especially in this book, two women
Mhm.
living together. So I
Yeah.
recommend reading that for anyone who's interested.
I just heard of that book. I was reading an article that was talking about a few different articles, that was talking about a few different books recently, or some of them have been made into movies maybe, I'm not sure, but it was like 3 different instances of women living together in, um, not in any kind of romantic relationship or anything like that, but it was just like, "We both need a place, let's try to make this work," and of course it's gonna get difficult, sometimes it's gonna get there'll be misunderstandings but that's how you wind up working out your hard edges off with other people, and we do have these we have, Saint Benedict and some of these other rules that can give guidance if we're looking for that. We don't have to start from totally from scratch. We have actually guidance from other older times. Um, I don't know if people necessarily would even kind of know, "Oh, that if I wanna do this, there are actually resources. This has been done before. This has
Yep.
happened before, and we don't have to, wonder how can we live together?" There's actually guidance there, and it would be interesting to see some of these iterations of different living arrangements where people become family to each other, or extended families or whatever it is. It's getting much more difficult for younger people to, say, get a house, um, and I've seen advertisements, which is interesting. It's like, "Buy a house with your friends." And that could be difficult, like, financially of figuring out who owns what and what if, you separate out of the house and all those things, but it's also like a financial reality, a necessity in certain places that you're not gonna be able to be in your 20s and be able to get a house unless you would cooperate with somebody else, and so how that turns out in intentional communities will be really I'll be interesting to hear. I mean, sure there'll be books and stuff written about that in the coming years about how that happens. But we do have these forebears, the desert elders and how they had, times of work, times of prayer, times of eating together, times of silence and there's a kind of rhythm to their life that maybe people will be yearning for in soon or in times to come.
Yeah.
I know you're out in California, and I know that's, like, notoriously the high high rent, and, do you notice anybody doing things like that already?
Yeah, I've heard of, a few examples of people, choosing to live together. And even for myself, like, in Taiwan, it's normal, right, to have your
Mhm.
parents, right? You have
Yes.
multi-generational households and
Mhm.
learning to live in that way, right? With
Yeah.
multiple generations in one home. And so
Mhm.
that's a value that even
Mhm.
though I'm in the States, that I want to live into. And so that's
Mm.
something that my family does as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for many people around the world, that's the necessity, but it's a chosen way of life, but it's also in some cases necessity that, it's you wanna be together to help each other, and you have to be together to help each other.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to ask you too, and you already mentioned this about Jerome and Marcella, but I wanted to ask you what desert elder or what wisdom stands out to you from the book and why, in terms of from your perspective as a spiritual director and how you might want to teach somebody about some of the wisdom or some of the ideas or some of the specific stories and lessons from one of the elders. Does anything stand out to you in your mind that you would share from that perspective?
Yeah, well, the one that stood out to me the most is not because of the wisdom, but because of how fun it is. And that is Simeon the Stylite, who
Yeah.
is not just that he lived on top of a mountain, he lived on top of a pillar, right? A little
Right,
spot, little
right.
point on the mountain.
Wow.
And just, I remember I read articles about people who still do this of
Oh.
like right living in some you have to climb up some ladder to get to them or so then
Oh.
how food is delivered to them in that way and
Oh.
it just reminds me right that even in the Taoist and Buddhist traditions we see people who go to these extremes, these environmental
Yeah.
extremes,
Right.
for some sort of spiritual cultivation that they're seeking in
Mm.
themselves. And so whether that's a cave or a mountain or a desert,
Yeah.
there's something about the relationship with the environment and how that then kind of cultivates or crafts
Mm.
um, their spirituality and the inner work that they're seeking to do.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why, this desert tradition itself, it's so interesting, is the desert, right? The
Yeah.
desert itself as sort of a
Yes.
character in the
Mhm.
story or in the tradition.
Yes.
So once again, for you, then,
Mhm.
what do you think the role of that desert is, as you were reading about the desert elders?
Right, I love how you put it that the desert itself is like a character, and it really is because it's so abandoned, it's so foreboding to a lot of people. They don't wanna go out there. There aren't, there isn't civilization out there for a reason because it's so far away from resources and it's so remote. It's not practical, and the weather is harsh, extremes with the desert and in the cold and in the heat, and it sounds daunting. Like, when I think about, "Well, would I wanna do that?" No, not really. I guess I'm just a big baby, and I'm stuck with my luxuries, and um, uh, but it is really a proving ground, and the desert is like that in the Bible. We see these stories of prophets being in the desert, of Jesus going out into the desert and the wilderness places um, to really have a time of uninterrupted solitude, and I think that really impresses on me just how important remote places can be, and maybe it's remote in the sense that maybe it's not days walk away, but that it's something that we should think about putting into our lives, times of real solitude and silence and stillness, that the place does matter, or that you get away from the hustle and bustle of regular life, that there's something about the isolation that God can work seemingly very differently in us, and I think it's just for the desert elders and the brothers and sisters out there, the desert was definitely vital in their development. It played a really important role that it wasn't close to town, that these places would take days to get to. And so I think it's a formative setting. Um, and of course, there are still places like this now. There are still communities in these places that were from that time, and sometimes they were run off of their monasteries, and then they came back and they rebuilt over and over, and you can still find them in Egypt. It was Phoebe Farag Makil went there, I think in August, went to, Egypt, to the place where, in the Nitrian desert, where it's Abba Moses community is still there, and so there's still people living like this, and it's very obviously very simple, um, and your priorities change, and you don't have the same distractions, and you don't have the same trappings that you would in kind of a city environment. So I think that these Christians were very purposeful in choosing the wilderness as their proving ground, and um, something that could help their discipline, their training, and their devotion, and I think it underscores that that's also practical for us and profitable for us, to not be afraid of simplifying it and, maybe sometimes choosing remote or uninteresting places, for ourselves to see what God wants for us, even if it's just for a short period of time, and, um, we have, of course, the examples of John the Baptist and some of the prophets and Jesus that they spent time out there, and maybe we should consider some of the solitude and silence for ourselves. And I'm interested to know too, like to kind of bounce it back to you. Have you chosen? I mean, I know you're a pretty introverted person anyway, and you do a lot of traveling and stuff. But have you made sure that you've chosen places of solitude for yourself for spiritual formation?
Yes, I do have an annual rhythm that if you follow me on social media, you get a
Yes.
peek into, which
Yes.
is I have the privilege of working remotely, and I have the privilege of being single, and so I do spend 3 or 4 months out of the year living in Asia, working remotely from there, and it is for that extreme solitude. Even though I'm in
Mhm.
major cities in Asia, usually,
Hmm.
it's a place, where often people don't know me, right? So I'm in cities where
Mhm.
I don't know anyone, no one knows me, and I'm
Yeah.
spending extended time there.
Mhm.
Um, One of the main things is being away helps me say no, whereas
Mm.
when I'm in LA, it's harder, right? It's harder to say no to all the commitments to community and to work and to all that
Yeah.
stuff. So just being away is an easy way to say, "Oh, sorry, I'm out of town." So one, it helps
Yeah.
me to say no to things, and then
Hmm.
second, there's something about the feeling of being anonymous
Hmm.
that is good for my ego, right? Like,
Oh, yeah.
getting to know myself um, in environments where no one knows me and I don't know anywhere else. And
Mhm.
there is a limit to that. In the end, I do need to return to community and
Mhm.
have my identity reflected in community. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I need that healthy rhythm of just
Mhm.
checking in with who I
Mhm.
am. Do I still know who I am?
Yeah.
And having the spaciousness to do that.
Hmm. That's that's well said. I think it could be, like, depending on what your obligations are, it's not so easy for everybody to take time away like that, but
Mhm.
it's still, um, I think begs repeating that there are still things that we can draw away to into some more solitude. Like, even when I was in the throes of having little babies, I would try to get a shower quiet in quiet. I would try to there you still can kind of carve out times that you're being purposeful about the silence that you have, and the the isolation in a way that is intentionally planned to some degree, to whatever degree it can be, and that you're taking that time out again to because if we only know, at least for myself, I'm thinking, if I only know myself in relationship to other people, I do need to check back in and see where, in some ways, where my loves are disordered or my priorities are disordered, or am I seeking approval from people? Am I doing too much pleasing? Am I, all the different things that need to be corrected that maybe can only show up in my alone time with God that I've set aside for solitude like that. And so I'm hoping that as people see the desert elders, that they see how their lives were, that they think, "Oh, wow, solitude, silence, and stillness. I'd love to add those in, and how can I add those in, to my life in my own way that makes sense in terms of my relationship with myself and God, but of course in relationship to community, what is that gonna do for that?" Um, I for me, the elders have been, um, they've impressed that on me, and they've inspired me to think in those terms too. So, and I wanted to ask you too, um, we know that the desert elves, I spoke about this just briefly before, they're they think differently than the Western mind. They're more Asian in their way of thinking about the world because there's a more integration, happening. There's more of a holistic notion of reality and not these spheres that there's these false separations and dichotomies. And so with that in mind, what do you think they can offer us in our way of thinking? How could they guide us today?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really drew me to the desert elders is the similarities between the Christian desert elders
Yeah.
and Taoist elders, right? Taoist
Mhm.
philosophers and
Mhm.
teachers. I mean, even the similarity just in writing style, right? Like
Mm.
in both of these traditions, what you get from these original texts is like little tidbits, right?
Yeah,
Little,
yeah.
quotations,
Mm.
these short stories about usually about a relationship between an elder wisdom figure and a student or a seeker,
Yes.
and gaining wisdom from these little conversations that we have. So both of these traditions kind of have that in the writing
Yeah.
style. And I
Mm.
think what that emphasizes to us is the importance of the wisdom of our elders
Mm.
in a modern culture that prioritizes youth, right?
Right, right.
But actually seeking our elders and the spiritual traditions and the wisdoms that they pass down to us.
Mm.
And then
Mhm.
I think another really important similarity between the desert elders and Taoist Taoist elders is
Mhm.
this really key idea of the importance of indifference. It's
Oh,
apatheia, right? In the desert
yes,
tradition, it's
yes.
wu wei in the Taoist tradition, or non-action in the Taoist tradition.
Mm,
And neither of those terms means doing nothing, right? But both of
mm.
those terms highlights the importance of non-attachment, which we also find in the Buddhist tradition. So
Right.
these three ancient traditions that highly value this concept of non-attachment, non-action, and it emphasizes that our identity and our worth is not in the things we do. And
Mhm,
I
mhm,
think Belden Lane, writes about apatheia really well. He has a quote that I use often, right? That apatheia, or indifference, or wu wei, is developing a fierce indifference to the unimportant things, so
mm.
that right, we can focus on the important things.
Ah,
And I think that is such it's key to leadership. It's key to our spirituality,
mm,
that we know just as much what's not important, what we can
mm.
let go of, what we can ignore, so that we can give our energy and our focus to the things that are truly important. And that discernment, right, is so important. So I think that's a key concept that comes from both traditions.
Yes. Yeah.
So I can list many more, but those are highlight a couple of those.
I love that you bring that up, and I wanna drill down into it for a minute because for the people who find this to be new, a new concept,
Hmm.
which some people might, it's not talked about that much in certainly not in evangelicalism that I know of. But, and how and maybe you can explain how it would show up for you. One of the ways I can understand it is a really loose hold on my expectations too. So, it can be other things than that, but for instance, the attachment thing would be to attach to an idea or an aim or something that I think I want or I need or I should have. And to not try to control that, but to realize that some things will come into my life and some things will leave, and I don't have to and those could be opportunities, those could be people, those could be activities, different things, but that it's not going to shake me when there's a disruption because I'm anchored like down to a buoy down to like the ocean floor and the waves could be going, but I'm just gonna be basically anchored, right? And I think of it in kind of those terms, how it might flesh out in my life, where my original idea, my thing I might be drawn to do in malformation would be like, "Oh, I want that to work out this way," or I want something from this person, or I have some need," or, and where I'm trying to kinda hang on to it really tightly. And this idea, apatheia, holy indifference, is that God is enough and God's will, um, be the that guiding path, right? And I might be kind of describing it all messed up and confused, but that's sort of how I wind up considering those ideas and seeing them in expressions in my life, and I'm wondering, what does that look like? What does apatheia or some of the how we might think of this, how does that show up for you?
Yeah, I think you identified the key there, which is our relationship to control.
Uh-huh.
That we are constantly trying to control our lives, our other people, because it
Mhm.
gives us a sense of certainty and safety in our life to try to control things. But I think what
Mm.
apatheia and wu wei is trying to posture us in a way in which we recognize what we can't control. And so
Mm.
in the Taoist tradition, it is the example of it is in our relationship with nature,
Mm.
and recognizing we can't control nature, and we
Mm.
can't, you're right, we can't control the weather, right? So
Right.
it's recognizing, okay, I can't control the weather.
Mm.
However, I can choose how I respond to the weather. So
Yeah,
then it's
yeah.
the same with life, with other people. We cannot control other people.
Mhm.
However, I can choose how I respond to other people, knowing I can't control them, right? So
Mm.
then it's being able to discern in our daily life
Mhm.
what we can't control, and but how we choose to respond.
Mm.
And that is so important to a
Mm.
healthy life, a healthy
Yes.
spirituality is that recognition of what
Mhm.
we can't control.
Oh, and that's like for me and for many people, that's like a lesson to learn over and over, you know?
Yep.
But it can also be a great unburdening if people are unfamiliar with it. Like if someone's watching this right now and they're like, "Yeah, that's kinda me. I kinda want, to make sure people are helping me or doing this or that something's happening or that I'm moving toward a goal." To think about that you would unburden yourself with an indifference and not an indifference like, "Oh, who cares? Nothing matters." Not that kind of
Right.
indifference, but that need to manage and or manipulate or massage things into place how you want it, that it's okay to let the steering wheel go. And, the steering wheel's probably not attached to anything either. We're just trying to, we're trying to steer stuff, but we can't really steer much of anything. And that actually can be a great unburdening, like, "Oh, okay, not my job. Not my job to fix everything and to manage everything, and not my job." And and I think for some people, that's gonna be a really new feeling if you sink into it. It's gonna be a really new feeling, but it also is, um like Jesus says, if you can't worry and add a day to your life. Like worrying is not gonna add like 1 hour, 1 day to your life. It's not gonna make any impact. You're just gonna kind of, um, fret your life away worrying, but it won't it won't add anything. And I think that's for our times too. I think that because we can kind of control many things that happen, and we
Yeah.
kind of sometimes slide into a dashboard mentality, maybe because screens habituate us to reacting like that. We can kind of be really displeased when people don't act in ways we're hoping they will or in ways we think they should, and that sense of control rears its head or maybe our ego gets in the way. So that this whole idea of wu wei, like you're saying, and holy indifference, um, is something really worth digging into, embracing, and sinking into. And it's kind of almost an act of resistance toward the maladies of our culture too that would say,
Mhm.
"You should be in charge. You're owed that. You have these rights to control your life and make sure everything happens how you want." It's kind of a way to say, "No, I'm not gonna be, sucked into this cultural expectation where I do that." But I think it really is countercultural. I don't know if it's as countercultural in Asian traditions as it is here. Would that be true, or how would you see that?
Well, I think because we've had Wu Wei as a spiritual practice, right, a value, it is more ingrained, although, any human being likes control and will try to control. However, I think, Taiwanese folks would be familiar with the concept of Wu Wei and what that means. But
Mhm.
it's hard, right? It's hard, and that's why it's taught as a spiritual practice, right?
Right,
It
right.
takes intentional cultivation as a practice,
Mm,
and right, and especially in our modern times, we live in a highly anxious culture, right?
mm,
Highly
hmm,
anxious times, and that anxiety, right, is coming out of that need to control something and
mm.
and feeling those tensions with the things that can't be controlled and the things that are unknown. And so um, that indifference, that wu wei, is then a practice in those moments of anxiety.
Right, if it was natural, we wouldn't need to be taught.
Right.
It was something we just figured out. We wouldn't have the lessons from the wise ones telling us about it, and that's an excellent point.
Mhm.
Um, I think let's see, I know when we were sending questions to each other, there's one that you were gonna ask me about, the
Yeah,
outdated
yeah.
tradition.
Yeah, I think as I was reading your book, and something you mentioned at the beginning, which I do want to say was very helpful for your book, is that you integrate the desert abbas and ammas, the fathers and mothers,
Mhm.
whereas usually we have to go to different sources, one to look at the abbas and another to look at the ammas, but
Yeah.
yours is integrates all of them together really well. So I appreciate that about your book.
Okay.
However, as I was reading your book, I think something I was reminded of is it does use the desert tradition does use outdated language.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
it made me curious about, well, what drew you to the desert tradition, and why do you think it's important to learn from this really ancient tradition in
Yeah.
our times, knowing
Mhm.
that some of the language is quite outdated.
Yeah, like, there's words like acedia, and, it
Right.
wasn't, like, rolling off my tongue immediately until I looked into it more. Yeah, and there's things that, um, they have vows of chastity and poverty and obedience, and that's not like our typical
Yeah.
your first thought isn't gonna be like, "Well, I have so much in common with them," and we have a lot of luxury in how we live, of climate-controlled homes or hot water or indoor plumbing or supermarkets with all kinds of, options for us, and they had so little, and so it can seem like, well, how do they really relate to us? Do they even relate to us? And I think I was just drawn by their extremely human stories, their human foibles, and their problems that I also saw myself in some of those problems and some of their victories, their, like, hard-won victories. I'm thinking of Abba Moses, who was, had a life of crime and could do whatever he wanted to whoever he wanted at any time. He's a big guy and he's an angry guy, and I think about how many decades he spent in obedience and service to his brothers and his spiritual fathers, and through tons of hard lessons and work, he transformed to this beautiful, peaceful, gentle, humble, revered, and beloved, spiritual elder, and I think it was just so inspiring. Some of those stories were just so inspiring to me, and they saw the world differently and more holistically, and that framework is more important to me now than maybe it ever has been. I want to be an integrated person living an integrated life, and, um, that kind of way of seeing everything as God's, everything as spiritual, is has helped me reorient my life, and, um but I think that their how seriously they took their spiritual advancement and intimacy with God, something I also admired, and I am thinking, I don't have that kind of devotion that I'm gonna leave everything behind and go to a convent or something. I don't have that, but I think that, um, their desire for that, their desire to be close to God, it just kind of wooed me in, and also I was impressed with something I didn't expect. I thought it was gonna be more cloistered, their lives would be more isolated from other people, but they were so hospitable. They would take in guests, and they would take in pilgrims going to the Holy Land, but anybody who wanted to stay with them for a little while. They were exceptionally hospitable to the sick, to the hungry, to the poor, and that's just like the virtues of their life were very inspiring. I think that it was Evagrius who was my gateway drug into the into the whole world because he wound up impressing on me about how our thoughts are not us. Our thoughts are something we have, and that we don't have to attach to them and think and identify with them so severely. We can know that feelings and thoughts come and they go, and this whole landscape, of the inner life to me was just so impressive, and then I realized, well, he's basically a kind of a psychological genius to me, where he could, by such good observation and his own personal experience, he was seeing how do people get tripped up with these different afflicting thoughts, and he could
Mhm.
tell, he was telling his students, "Here's what's coming. It's first it's gonna be the gluttony and the food." He was telling them, "These are the 9 or the 8 or the 9." When it got to he added envy later, but I thought, what a brilliant teacher, what a brilliant mind. So that's what sucked me in, and and I just found that no matter humanity has these similar problems. They're ageless, whether we're going to be envious of somebody or whether we're going to want to feel like we want to show off our righteousness with vainglory and kind of, show people I'm a good person. That these afflicting thoughts or temptations that can move into sin at some point when we make agreements with them. They're just our common human experience. And for that reason, the elders are completely timeless. They're timeless teachers because we are all always going to be struggling with these things, just like they did. It might not look the same in terms of where they stayed or what they ate and drank and everything like that, but they had problems in community about with envy or with lust or whatever they were. And I think it shows to me that my life doesn't have to imitate the values and the priorities of my death-dealing, soul-sucking culture. I
Mhm.
can be different. I can live differently in my thoughts, but also maybe how I interact in the world and how I develop community. And so they kind of tell me that I belong to God and not to these formulations imposed by such a damaging culture that, doesn't care for my spiritual well-being, doesn't care for my, that I experience intimacy with God and the good life within myself, but with others too. So,
Mhm.
I don't know. What do you find, that draws you into them besides what we've already spoken about?
Yeah, yeah, I think, I agree with some of what you said of, in your book you use the term vices, but another term that's commonly used is false selves, right? Like
Yes.
what the
Right.
desert, in tradition
Mhm.
invites us to is
Mhm.
the first thing that happens when we quiet down is we encounter our false selves.
Mm.
And the only way to access our true selves, our most sacred selves, is to become familiar with our false selves, to
Mm.
meet them with compassion, and
Mm.
then to ask, well, do I need that false self?
Right, right.
And how do I then release, let go of these false selves that I've built up for myself
Mhm.
so that I can live more deeply into my most sacred self, my truest self.
Mm.
And so that too is also why, similar to what you said, like why I, find, wisdom in the desert tradition.
Mm. So this has been really good. I'm gonna draw to a close, but I wanted you to give any final thoughts or wisdom that you'd like to share as we're kind of closing out. But also, I'm sure maybe people who are listening or watching would like to learn from you, and what opportunities would they have to be able to do that? Maybe you can share that too.
Sure. Well, I just want to express a gratitude that you wrote this book, and I'm glad that you put in the work. It takes a lot of research, right, to write a book like this, but I'm
Yeah,
glad you put in that work
thank
to just continue to give modern language to this
you.
ancient tradition,
Mhm.
and to contribute your own voice in that
Thank
way.
you. Thank you.
Um, and then for the folks that are interested in my work, you can, find my stuff at ourunforming.com or on Instagram. My handle is ourunforming. So feel free
Oh,
to
and for me.
connect to me there.
Yeah, which is the title of your book. And would you mind sharing the books that we've covered, or any of the other work that you would like to point people toward?
Sure. I have two books out there. The first is called Our Unforming, which is on de-Westernizing spiritual formation.
Mm,
My second book is called Contemplative Witnessing, which is written for BIPOC spiritual directors or about,
mhm,
spiritual direction with BIPOC communities. And
mhm.
so feel free to check those out too.
Very good. That's great. And um, are you doing a cohort right now, or are you like what stage are you in terms of like how you're teaching and where you're teaching?
Yes. So I am director of Liberated Together Spiritual Direction School, which is a spiritual direction school for women of color, queer women of color, trans people of color. And we just graduated our third cohort. And so
Oh,
we then this month will open applications for our next cohort. So if you're interested, if you're a woman of color, queer, or trans person of color, interested in training as a spiritual companion, a spiritual care practitioner, check out our school, Liberated Together Spiritual Direction School.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Cindy, for just joining me here, being willing to converse with me about this. Your wisdom is just invaluable to me. I find that when I go through your book, once in a while I pick up books, my favorite books, and I'm always taught by them. The Spirit moves in me through your words, and I'm very thankful for that. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, it was great to have this conversation with you, Lisa.
All right, everybody. The next book chat will be May 17th with Robert J. Monson, and I hope you tune in for that. Each co-host that I've had throughout Lent and into everybody has been so different, so unique, so special in their own way. So make sure you go back and look at some of those other things that have happened. I think everyone is such a treat, and it's kind of like getting a different delicious dessert to like sink your teeth into each time. There's nobody is like anybody else, but that's what I absolutely love about it. So that's been really fun to be in conversation with different co-hosts. So everybody, thank you for joining us, and see you the next time.
Bye, all.
Bye-bye.